In my first vlog, I explained that Christians and non-Christians alike were mostly in Plato's cave, that space in one's head where you hold to various false worldview assumptions, not because you are stupid, but because you have been surrounded by bad policy, bad ideas for so long that you can no longer see the wood for the trees. Sadly, this is the case for most people in this world. But stay with me through my vlogs, and I will try to dig you out of the cave so that you can breathe free air again and see where the West and the Western Church need to be headed if they are both to survive the perfect storm now swirling around the West. Hello, I'm Michael Saxon, your public policy Christian, the public policy Christian, because there are precious few other Christians or even secular people on my side of the spectrum actually talking about ideas, ways forward, solutions. They all instead tend to wallow in what's going wrong and what the problem is and what they see the next situation as embodying for the destruction of the West. But in this vlog, I will unfold my strategy for the resuscitation of Western civilization and the rebuilding of the Western Church through what I'm calling the Next Generation Church Evangelism Strategy, NGCES. In this vlog, I will take you on a journey I took to arrive at the Next Generation Strategy, and then I will focus specifically on what I call the problem, capital T, capital P. It all began some 10, 12 years ago with a situation analysis prompted by two things: the 2007-8 world financial crisis and the realization accompanying it that the so-called conspiracy theories going way back to the 1970s and even earlier than that were turning out to be conspiracy fact. We were actually, as people and as nations, being swallowed up in debt and all sorts of societal dysfunction, and the people pushing the whole swindle were making sure they and their corporations via monopolies and complicit governments, which I call the political class, were raking in vast wealth at our expense and cementing themselves in their positions of absolute power. Now I'm going to take you through a diagram here, an overlay you'll see on the screen, which basically charts the course I took. As I said, I began with a situation analysis, and I applied to that situation analysis a set of analytical criteria, which I drew from a Christian worldview. I came up with about 12 aspects to a Christian worldview, and then I reduced them down to what I call the 5 core Christian worldview principles, or you can call them the 5 principles, 5 core principles, 5 core values, whatever you like. And I use those as an analytical tool to assess the situation analysis. And from there, I came up with a problem statement. You always, when you're doing a situation analysis, should in the end identify the problem you want to address. And I call it the 3-2-1 problem. There are 3 facets or aspects or challenges to the problem. There are 2 giants, fascist liberalism and feudal corporatism, and 1 weak Western Church. So what I did was apply the 5 core Christian worldview principles to the problem. And I realized that to deal with the problem, the church had to stop being part of it and come out of it. It could do that by applying the 5 core principles through the 12 reforms, which are used to confront the 2 giants. And by doing that, they would open up opportunities to rebuild the church and also set the stage for or provide a public agenda for the moral, spiritual and intellectual leadership that was needed in resurrecting Western civilization. So 2 major goals to achieve there by applying the 5 principles through the 12 reforms to the problem, taking the church out of the problem, making it part of the solution. Now let's zero in and take a closer look at the problem. And here's my second overlay. Remember, we're talking about the problem, the 3-2-1 problem, 3 challenges or facets, 2 giants and 1 weak Western Church. So I just propose to just simply read through what I've got here for you, and you can follow along. So we're talking here about the first challenge, giant number 1, fascist liberalism. And I use the adjectives fascist, and in the case of the second giant, feudal, deliberately and with good reason, as we'll see in later vlogs. Since the 1960s, the West has been subject to liberal cultural deconstruction. The consequence of societal dysfunction, attacks on West Judeo-Christian values, have been orchestrated by a liberal fascist minority intent on building a socialist corporate utopia cut loose from the values that made Western civilization possible. That's the fascist liberal giant. Second giant, feudal corporatism. Corporate and banking interests addicted to global scale power and usury, interest-bearing debt, have usurped classical capitalism and dovetailed with liberal politicians to drive people towards covetousness and group acquiescence before a feudal corporate aristocracy, you can call it a plutocracy, an oligarchy, whatever you like, within which most of the world's riches have been unjustly concentrated, all at our expense. And the third challenge is a weak Western Church. The Western Church has progressively failed to respond to multiple attacks and in the process lost connection with the cultural kingdom-building implications of its worldview. Without that connection, it can no longer stand for the Judeo-Christian tenets that undergird the West or effectively prosecute the Great Commission or the Great Command. What I call, and I think what most Christians would call, the two great commands. So metaphorically speaking, the church recrossed the Jordan. It had no reason or right to do so, but it did it anyway, and headed back out into the wilderness from whence it came thousands of years ago, to wander around aimlessly for the last 50 years. Well, it's now time for the church to come in from the promised land. And when we get to the 5 core principles in a later vlog, I'll make it clearer what I mean there at the bottom right by lost, made in God's image potential, and that is critical to Christian policy-based ideas for resurrecting the West. So, in my next video, I will take a closer look at the two giants and all the evil they have caused. Just about everything swirling around us today is the product of the machinations of those two evil beasts. If that does not prize you out of Plato's cave, nothing will. From there, we will start looking at all the things we can do, the policy options, if you like, to take down the two giants using the 5 core Christian worldview principles and the 12 reforms. If the church was ever to come in from the wilderness and finally make itself useful by confronting the two giants, the opportunities for evangelism would grow exponentially. See you next time.